Hello. So, earlier today, I wanted to record a session, a professional development session that I had in the new school district that I worked for, Rockaway Township. And unfortunately, the video lasted about 10 minutes. It had a 10-minute runtime before it got cut off. Um, so I didn't get to film it all, and I did want to record the entirety of the session just so that I could, you know, play it back, use it for further professional development, or create some kind of video library that describes, the things that I'm discussing in the session. Since it didn't happen, what I'd like to do is I'd like to record a little bit of the presentation, or record the entirety of the presentation here from my kid's office space. So I've got my two daughters' desks there, and I'm sitting at my little console here. And I want to go over the concepts of gamification and SAMR within the classroom, and the specifically also the role of role playing with regard to gamification. So let me just pull that up, and we'll begin. There we go. Okay, so start off. My name is Bibars Al-Tayyib. I am the Chief Technology Officer for the Rockaway Township Board of Education. I've been in educational technology for the past 18 years. I've been developing games for the past, I want to say, 4 to 5 years. And I've also been interested in educating through gamification for quite some time. So I created a Google Classroom to kind of show the different aspects of gamification that you could run through within a classroom environment, and using Google Classroom specifically. So let's start off with what is gamification. So what does gamification mean? Basically, gamification is using characteristics of gameplay and their mechanics to attract student involvement through their preferred medium. So it's basically taking the interests that kids have, the things about games, the mechanics of the games that the kids like and that attract them, and then rolling those mechanics into your classroom so that way you are better engaging with the kids and that you are tapping on those key things that really bring them back to the gaming environment. As it stands right now, the amount of kids that game for over 4 hours a day is over the 90th percentile, give or take. So there is a substantial interest in gaming from kids and all throughout, their ages. And in general, if you see a kid playing a video game, they are able to learn those games fairly simply, fairly easily. And because there is, aside from these mechanics, there is a vested interest in it. And I'd like to see that take place in the classroom as well. The other side of gamification could also involve gameplay and restructuring assignments into game-like experiences. But I'll get into that a little bit more of that later on. So what gamification is not. Gamification isn't throwing your kid in front of an app. It isn't investing heavily into a large gamify your classroom application. You can use those applications; they're great, but it doesn't have there's no single platform that says this is the thing that you have to buy for your classroom if you're planning on gamifying your classroom. So there is no investment in equipment. There's no investment in software. It's just a thing that you do. And there is very low-cost ways of doing it. It's also not necessarily an exact fit. I'm not going to say, for instance, that gamification is the end-all, be-all of the newest educational tool that that everybody must jump on, and this is going to save the educational system, and this is revolutionary. I mean, there is some revolutionary ideas behind it, but for the whole, Anybody that claims that this is the next thing that will carry all students forward is probably setting themselves up to be made fun of in 5 to 10 years time. Even if you look at things like STEM, which was this huge thing, this concept of STEM, eventually became STEAM, and now they're talking about it becoming STREAM, just because as time goes on, you realize that more and more and more gets involved. Same too with this. I'm not expecting uh, this to solve every problem, but there for the kids that it does help, for the environments that it does help in, it seems to be very effective. It also doesn't require full investment, and I want to say that the more that you invest into something, the greater the impact it has. But I'm not expecting teachers to show up to class wearing a wizard robe and hat. The idea is that there are certain things that you could bring into your classroom that can assist, and gamification is multifaceted. So you can take a little, or you could take a lot, or whatever the case may be, and you can bring that into your classroom. Um, it also doesn't necessarily contradict the standard models of education. So you're not necessarily throwing out your curriculum, you're not throwing out your lesson planner, but there would have to be some investment on your end to make things work. There might be a little bit of extra work on the back end in order to set up the situations that your kids are going to enjoy in the classroom. Uh, but as you'll see through, as a guide, you through the process, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going by the wayside. And again, it's not necessarily a solution to every situation, but it does show impactful results. The next thing that I need everybody to understand about the information that I'm giving you is that I'm stealing it. I'm stealing a lot of this information, and I'll be 100% honest with that. Well, not all of it, but a large part of the gamification processes that I'm describing in this course lesson come from this guy, or I at least heard him from this guy, Chris Aviles. Great guy. He's been doing gamification talks for a long time. Follow him at Teched Up Teacher. Go to his website, techedupteacher.com. He also has a gamification guide on his site that provides free resources for teachers and educators, and it fully describes this process that he's used and the rationale behind it. And he has a lot of the data that backs up the efficacy of gamification. But since I'm an adult and since I'm in the educational sphere, it's not called stealing. It's actually called applying proven methodologies through successfully implemented practices. So there's that. And then the other thing I want to talk about is SAMR. So what is SAMR? SAMR is a system introduced by, I should probably know the name of the guy that created it. SAMR was created by Dr. Ruben Puentedura. Yes, there we go. And what he did was he broke down. Let me just drag this over here. Oops, too far. Okay. So what he did was he broke down the method for inclusion of technology into your classroom into 4 different points. So starting right off with the S, it stands for substitution. Oh, that's getting cut off. Let me just take that here and bear with me, folks, while I drag that over a little bit. There we go. Shrink that down a smidge. Sorry, bear with me. Just want to make sure that all the information is visible on the screen here. That's good enough. That's good enough for me. There we go. So, there we go. Substitution. So substitution is basically inclusion of technology into a curriculum that doesn't necessarily affect the thing that they're doing, with the exception that it is now using technology. So that means like I'm using a word processor rather than writing it by hand. There's no real great impact or change in the process that is being done by using technology in lieu of something else. Another big example you'll see often is when a teacher uses a projector and uses just a document camera. You're just or using a projector and just showing slides, like kind of like what I'm doing now to an extent. But basically, you're just showing a thing that you could have shown by either writing it on the board or whatever the case may be. There are some functional improvements, of course, because of the speed and access and availability of the assignments that you're providing, but nonetheless, substitution basically means I'm replacing this with technology. But that's okay. It's okay to use technology because it allows you to maintain, retain, and disseminate information at a reasonable rate. The next one is augmentation. So now I am taking an assignment that I'm handing to a kid, and now I'm able to augment the assignment to some degree. So now I'm able to use this assignment to collaborate, or I'm adding imagery, or I'm adding media to this assignment. Basically something that prior to the technology I would not have been able to do, or it would have been a little bit more difficult to do. I'm now adding to this assignment, something with the video, text, whatever, video, audio, what have you. Next, after that, the M stands for modification. So modification is basically I am now I'm changing the assignment that I initially would have given with something that I could do to a much greater degree with technology. So rather than writing a book report, now I'm doing a video. Rather than doing a presentation in front of a classroom, I am doing a online recorded, multimedia display. I'm doing a rap battle, or I'm doing a blog, or something like that. It's a change in the assignment based on the fact that it is now using technology as a whole. Then the last one, redefinition, is basically creating an assignment that would have up until that point been inconceivable without the use of technology to begin with. So that could mean, where's my little redefinition? There you are. So now I'm doing something completely different. And this could be something like creating a game, creating a full multimedia experience, connecting multiple things, communicating outside of the classroom, something that is on a much grander scale. Now, for the most part, you're not necessarily working your way up to redefinition, so you shouldn't consider SAMR as like this ladder that you're climbing through substitution, through augmentation to modification. Oftentimes it's suggested that teachers kind of dip their toe into at least one or the other, but to consider your use of technology within the classroom to determine if you are kind of languishing in substitution when you could be kind of moving around and exploring some of the other stages. And what I suggest typically to people is that the sweet spot where you want to be is a healthy balance of augmentation and modification, with substitution on the one end to make things the coursework or a little bit lighter, and using redefinition on the other end for those highly impactful projects that you want to do. So that's kind of like the baseline of SAMR and gamification. So let's go into gamification more in depth. Let me take a sip here. It's iced tea, so just so you know. All right. So gamification components. Let's pull that up. And I apologize for drinking in the middle of the presentation, but I'm fighting off a cold, so I need to keep hydrating. What are gamification components? What are the common gamification components? I'm not going to cover this slide because it's a little bit, redundant in the information, but I'll just go straightforward. Avatars. So we're looking at some avatars here that are very iconic. Oops, so now I'm covering these guys. Sorry about that, Mario. There we go. There is a reason characters like Mario and Link, almost made that mistake, and Link are so iconic and that have lasted for some 30 to 40 years that they've been around. And that is because the kids have built a relationship to these characters over the years. And a big part of that is I'll give you an example of when I was a little kid and I was sitting in front of a console and playing Mario Brothers for the first time back in the 80s. The first thing that you do is you run forward, and immediately you're killed by the first monster. And then the next time you know to jump. And you jump over that monster, and then you move forward and you discover things. And then as you go forward, you fall down a hole. Or you get hit by another monster, or you bounce off of a brick wrong. And over time, and through repeatedly dying, repeatedly failing, repeatedly trying to go through these levels, I've discovered that I can learn and move forward. And it also reduced the amount of fear that I had for dying, because even though I had a set number of lives at the time, although that changes down the line, even though I had a set number of lives, it's okay, because I could always start up again, and it was fun. And that is why it is a great idea to bring avatars, or the idea of gamer tags or such, into your classroom. So basically, you allow kids to assign themselves names, these fantasy names or handles or icons, whatever they want to describe them as, these characters that they create of themselves. And it does a lot of things for them. For one, it creates ownership of an identity. So it takes a kid and it says, I now own this character. This is my character. I control this character. I have ownership, and I have a sense of responsibility for this character that I wouldn't necessarily have given onto myself. But because it's a character, because it's externalized from myself, I have a reduced perception of risk. So I am not as fearful as I might have been. I'm willing to jump that hurdle. I'm willing to, slash the sword at that monster, because it is not me, it is this character. I am the character, but I am not taking the risk of the character. So there's a bit of externalization there. But also this idea of avatars built into a lot of the other gamification elements that are to proceed. So let's go in through some more of those. The next stage is groups, guilds, and teams. So what does that mean? It means inside your classroom, you're creating groups, and you're allowing those groups to select their own identity. You might recognize a couple of these symbols, from World of Warcraft, but this isn't a new concept. People have been rooting for their, favorite baseball team or football team since they've existed. But what happens when you create teams? So one is you build competitiveness. So you're activating that area that kids enjoy within games that allows them to compete against each other, but you're building it and you're using those avatars to create a environment where, again, it's externalized from the kids themselves. So even if they're like hashing it out to an extent, or they're like kids are like bantering back and forth, it's externalized to the characters that they've created, not to themselves. But also within each group, each cohesive unit, you're creating support for each other. You're creating pressure. So if one kid needs help, other people within the group would be more likely to boost them up, because their abilities are what impacts the group's score. Likewise, if a kid is slacking off, then those other kids will kind of set them straight, because they will encourage them to put in their 2 cents, to put in their fair share of the effort. And finally, there's a sense of pride. When you join and you create a group, there is a sense of pride that you build within that group and within that identity. And allowing kids to, again, to name that group is important because it creates an identity around the group. Of course, when you're talking about groups and guilds and stuff like that, you have, of course, you have options for differentiation and things like that. But I also want to be to caution any educator out there about like leaving no kid out. You know what I mean? Um, if before you discuss this, let kids know that they could submit this information to them in writing, or they can submit it through Google Classroom or whatever the case may be, because you don't want a kid necessarily left out of any one group. You can control the group and allow kids to make the recommendations to you. So they make recommendations, and then you let them know that you'll have final say on who's in what group. So that way, no kid is necessarily left in the left outside of the scope. It's important. The next stage is incremental earning and discovery. One idea behind this is, of course, and you've seen this in a lot of applications out there, is the idea of badge collection. So in the gaming sphere, you see a lot of achievements. In the educational software sphere, you see a lot of badges being earned, through things like Class Dojo and stuff like that. But again, these aren't new concepts. These concepts existed back when back with the Boy Scouts and things before that. You're earning badges for your achievements, and these are absolutely important because they provide a tangible evidence, a tangible item. Even if it's digital, it's still a tangible acknowledgement that you have achieved something within a set, within a set course or a set lesson or a set classroom. It encourages kids towards possession. Kids that desire completing games, they're like, you get your completionists, they will try to earn more badges because they are trying to complete the sense of completion. And oftentimes, when the badges are tailored to specific coursework, then you're not only increasing the amount of coursework that the kids are willing to put in order to earn these badges, but you're also increasing their willingness to participate outside of the coursework that you provide them. Finally, there's a couple other things. One, there is discovery. So often not informing students what some secret badges are gives a little bit of an air to the mystery that they like. So, like, say for instance, volunteering to help a fellow student or things like that, getting seen doing something like that. That could be almost a hidden achievement or something like that. That kids are rewarded for, and then with an intangible goal set in front of them, you increase the likelihood of behaviors that would achieve those goals. And then finally, there is reimbursement. Now, well, I don't mean necessarily that kids get like a pencil or something like that because they achieve things. Actually, it was noted by Chris Avilas that providing tangible items like pens and pencils and rewards like that, and candy and stuff like that, actually is not very effective. It's been proven to be not very effective. However, access is effective. So doing things like being able to, like, getting first in line, or being able to choose what, first pick at what job you get to classroom job that you have that week. Being able to hand in homework a day late, not necessarily not do homework, or not do an assignment, but like hand it in late or gain extra time. Those are all kind of access things that really work well into incremental earning, and also is easily experienced in games. When you earn an object through a quest or something in games, those objects don't necessarily they add to your ability to do work within the classroom, or sorry, do something within the game. And this is kind of the same concept. Sorry. I really should have structured these slides better so I don't have to keep on moving around my little image here, but there you go. Forward progression and leveling up. So forward progression is this idea that a character starts at level 1. And as they gain experience, they earn experience points. Those points eventually lead to a next level. As you can tell, the increase is constant. So whereas I start at level 1, there's no likelihood, or if I get to level 10, I'm not ever falling back to level 9. I'm continually going forward. I may not go to level 10 as fast, I may not reach level 10, but I'm never falling backwards. In the standard structure for grading, kids are constantly fluctuating between this passing and failing grade that kind of leads to pressure, it leads to stress, and it leads to this idea that no matter what happens, I'm starting my class at the very best I can be, and there is only the possibility of losing from there. Games have learned to flip that rationale and say you're starting at the bottom and you're working your way up through this experience. And I'll talk about it later when I discuss the assignments and how to redefine your assignments. But that is a big part of gamification that comes into play in classrooms, basically changing the standardized grading format so that kids are earning experience and gaining levels rather than passing or failing through A through F. Now, again, I mentioned before, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to throw out your curriculum. It needs to throw out your entire grading metrics and things like that. A lot of the things that you can do are just in redefining terms to make them more palatable to kids. Eventually, however, those scores can be flipped back to the standard grading model, and I'll show you exactly how that happens later. But also, using this method, this constant state of forward, upward progression, you have the ability to reach plateaus. And as you reach plateaus, you realize that the kid has now reached a point where they weren't before, but now they're there, and it can't be taken away from them. Reaching a plateau means that I've arrived at a destination and I'm ready to move on to the next step. That's something that doesn't happen with current grading systems. You don't get that sense of I have achieved something early on in the classroom. All you get is this constant back and forth of whether I'm doing good now or whether I'm not doing good now. Path selection and bonuses. A lot of you'll notice this path tree that you see from Path of Exile. But again, it's a concept that existed as for a long time, and more familiar. You'll see it a little bit more familiar in the game of life. The idea is that as you create assignments, you provide multiple paths to your students of what they can do in order to get to the desired outcome. So if your goal is to get a kid to be able to do long division, then you don't just necessarily set them to do long division through one means. You give them multiple options of how they can get to that point, and then you allow them to select themselves what the easiest or the most desirable path is to get there. So that's great because you can create differentiation, you can create reward systems based off of effort, and you can create achievements based off of how often kids go between one path or another, or how they select things, and you can get in a sense of how kids best learn the subject matter that you're trying to teach them. So it creates a bit of variability within your classroom, but still maintains the same quality effect that the desired outcome that you want to achieve. But it also gives the kid ownership of choice. To give you an example, when I was a kid, I would read hundreds of books a year. I would be in the library constantly, picking out my next choose your own adventure book, my next fantasy book, as heavy into that, but everything. I have never once liked a book that I was assigned by in school. I've never once decided that this is a great book for me. I mean, there were classics, and I believe if I had come to the decision to read those books on my own terms, I might have enjoyed them a lot more. But as a kid, I never liked the assigned books. I never liked being assigned something to read, and I really liked. I believe it was the my prior district that did it, as well as another district that picked it up. So the West Milford School District and Manchester Regional High School that picked it up. This idea that they did in their their high school level English courses, where they, instead of just 4 sections of English, they created a section for English sci-fi, a section for English romance, a section for English contemporary, things like that. So kids aren't just picking English 4, they're picking the type of book that they like to read in English. That was really cool, I thought. But yeah, having ownership of choice means that I get to decide how I'm learning, and that encourages me to learn. Um, the other thing I want to say is that you should always build extra credit into everything. Because why not? I mean, if the goal is to get kids to learn more rather than kind of pointing at what they're failing at, then build the opportunities for extra credit into assignments so that they strive for them. And if you're doing it in this XP point system, then they may always go for those. So build extra credit everywhere. And you can call them, bonus, optional quests or whatever you want to call them. And then finally, you get to reward investment. You get to reward the investment that the kids have put in to any given assignment based off of the efforts that they put forward. So the last stage of gamifying a classroom is redefining coursework. So basically what I'm suggesting here is that you create games that they play with each other. You create games where the knowledge and the research that they have ascertained becomes tools in their arsenal to play the game. You allow a lesson to be a component of gameplay rather than defining the aspect of it. And let me put it like this. Um, if kids are liking the game aspect of things, then using the game aspect of using games within your educational sphere seems like it would make sense. Uh, and there's plenty of games out there that you're not like forced to use just like the Milton Bradley standard. There are so many creative, unique, independent games out there. And I'm just looking at a couple of the games that I have on screen, for instance, from a matter of, for instance, history or social sciences. Timeline, for instance, is a game where you're slotting time. These are timed or dated cards that have events on them, and you're trying to determine where they fit on a timeline. So you can either put it before a card that has already been placed down or after. If you get it wrong, you don't get the point. If you get it right, you get the point. But as you're doing this, you are basically building a timeline, and as you're progressing, it gets harder and harder because you have to slot exactly in between 2 cards that are already down. If you're doing a lesson that has a lot of dates and timelines or events that occur in a series or progression, seems like a perfect game that you can build your own small game out of. Sorry. Um, Another example is One Night Ultimate Werewolf. So in this game, it's a party game, so again, great for a large classroom environment. But it's a party game where basically one person is the werewolf, and everybody has to figure out through discussion and dialogue who is the werewolf. So you go in rounds. Each time you go through, the werewolf gets a chance to take out, or somebody gets a chance to be taken out of the game. As time moves on, it feels a little bit like these, like these murder mystery dinner things that you've seen in movies. Um, but this is a great concept that you could use for things like who's the Confederate soldier, who's the Union spy, who is the who you know especially if you're trying to teach like things like historical battle, um, historical events that have multiple sides to them. You can use context clues based off of where the person comes from, what their ideological opinions are, things like that to determine who is the mystery character within your game. So knowledge of these events becomes your arsenal in winning the game. And then last but not least, I'd like to talk about role play, for instance. And I use the Dungeons and Dragons logo there because everybody's somewhat familiar with that as the major end-all be-all of tabletop gaming. But it isn't the end-all be-all. It's a fantastic game that I love and I play regularly, or semi-regularly because I'm in my 30s. But it is a fantastic game. But there are so many games that are out there for tabletop role-playing games that you can really just explore and see how they would play best within your class. But the question is, why would you want to play a role-playing game within your class? So I use this as an example. I pulled this up from it's a standard math question. Sam loves basketball and can sink the ball in the net 65% of the time. If he takes 30 shots, how many will he sink? So this is a seventh grade math question. And if I was a seventh grader, the first thing I would be asking is, who the hell is Sam? Why do I care how good he is at basketball? Um, I don't know anything about Sam. I don't have any investment in Sam's ability to dunk mad hoops. So why pose these random scenarios when they have no impact on the kid? Every source of literature, every kind of game, every kind of media that tries to educate kids does so through a narrative, a continuing narrative. If you're watching the Magic School Bus, you're seeing this zany teacher that's going on these field trips, and every field trip she goes on, you're learning different scientific facts. Every time you read Fancy Nancy, even though she's talking about how to be super fancy, she's also learning grammar and she's also learning words that she hasn't used before. And the kids learn through these forms of media because they are invested in the story and they're invested in a continuing story that they carry forward from the beginning of their education to the end of their education within that specific sphere. But when we get to the classroom, that seems to stop. We stop creating this ongoing narrative for kids, and we just throw these random Sams at them, like these generic Sams. I mean, like you can't get more generic. And apologies, by all means, to every Sam out there. Um, I mean, my fantasy name would be Bob, in all honesty, because I mean, I'm kind of I've been dealing with B-bars for quite a while. But you know, you get these generic characters that are thrown at them, and I was like, I don't really care how many bags Cindy has to make for her next party, or how many fruit Jonathan has to sell at the next, special event, or how many balls that Sam can dunk, or how fast it takes Martha to get to the park. I don't have any investment in these characters, so I don't have any investment in the problems, and I don't have any investment in the mathematics that are associated with those problems. So that's where role play comes into a great capacity for the educational classroom. So now, if you've been using all of these tools up until now, you've built this environment where kids can role play within the classroom. But you don't necessarily have to use the characters that they created or anything like that. That could be a part of it, but basically, you create an ongoing narrative that kids can use within the classroom to educate them on the things that they want, and you can use role play to do that. You could also use role play in the sense that you are working with kids in smaller groups, so they could use role play amongst themselves to solve problems, to create solutions, and as components of assignments, which I'll show you later. But role playing is a multifunctional tool. So just to give you an idea, what role playing actually means with regard to tabletop gaming is that one student or one kid or one adult or whatever the case may be takes on the role of a GM or a game master or a guide master or however you want to call it within the educational sphere. And they are providing basically guidance for a story that the other players or the students partake in. The students take on the role of characters within this ongoing storyline. So it is the goal of the GM or the guide to guide the kids through a series of events that lead to an intended outcome. Through this process, you can include any aspect of education that you want. So I can layer in storytelling, communication between students, morality discussion. I could layer in mathematics through the mechanics that are involved in the gameplay. I could layer in puzzle solving or problem solving. I could put in knowledge criteria. So, knowing how to combine elements into molecules can be a component of a problem that I have to solve within the narrative of this role-playing story. So basically, you're creating a narrative around the topic that you're trying to discuss or communicate with kids so that they actually have some investment in its knowledge, and it becomes a tool for them to use within the gameplay, which is a fantastic way to learn. It also allows you to answer that question, when would we have to know this? And you can do that, you've heard of when would I ever have to use this? If at this point it's a matter of put up or shut up. If you can't come up with a reason why you should know how to do a certain thing within a narrative that you're creating, then why will they care about learning that aspect? But if you are creating the narrative for them, prior to them asking the question, they are seeing the reason that they need to know this information. They are seeing the reason to know why they need to, consider the geometry over something or consider the history of a decision that was made. They get to see that information because you're creating the narrative that is already played out for them. So that's about it on gamification. Now let's see how we could take all of those gamification aspects and roll that into a SAMR-based model using Google Classroom. I'm going to get a sip real quick here. So Google Classroom is great, and it works really well with SAMR. One thing I noted in my class that I created is that I've added all the sources of media that I would need to teach the course. And that's important because I can add all my notes, I can add everything there. My daughter goes to a class, and the teachers actually one of the teachers actually grades them on their notes, which is terrible in my opinion, because she'll ask me questions about the assignment, and I ask her, well, didn't you learn this in class? Like, didn't she go over this subject? And she'll respond that she'll say, I was too busy taking the notes that the teacher was writing to actually pay attention to anything that the teacher was saying. That's just kind of terrible. And it's a bad use of SAMR because it's a bad, like, even on the substitution aspect. Like, she had the notes, they were in Google, but she was choosing to let them rewrite the notes right there. Not every kid, gains knowledge through writing something down. Sure, that works for some kids, but it doesn't work for all. So making that a requirement was weird and unnecessary. The better option, of course, is to provide the notes to everybody and provide the information to everybody. And you could do that very easily because you could disseminate information through a shared portal through Google, Google Classroom. So all of these notes are included in my Google Classroom. And this Google Classroom, since I'm not necessarily an educator of any specific subject within my school district, I created my own subject. I created my, I called it fantasy literature or storycraft or whatever the case may be. And I'm covering the monomyth as an example of a campaign that I am creating in my classroom. So again, I'm gamifying the classroom. It just means I'm in many aspects, I am changing the terminology to match things that are familiar to students. So I am creating a campaign centered around the monomyth. So I can include things like a TED Talk about the monomyth.
What if I told you they are all variants of the same?
And now I've provided them a resource that they have available to them at any time of day, so that they can go back to it and they can watch and rewatch and learn without me necessarily being there. And this helps also in people who flip classrooms, so that they're doing the learning outside of the classroom and they're coming into the classroom with that knowledge in hand, so that they can be provided more support within that classroom. So I've created all the handouts here. I've created this 17 stages of Joseph Campbell's monomyth, and I think at another point they break them down to 12. So I don't know what that's about. But there's all these different handouts I can include into my course. And what I created, actually, let me jump around a little bit and let me show you. I want to show you how the that's not it. All right, here we go. I want to show you how the actual gradebook might look. There we go. So here I created these names. Assuming these are the names of the kids here, let me zoom in a little bit so that way it becomes a little bit more visible on the screen here. There we go. So I've created the names of the kids, assuming these are your Bobs and your Bebarses and your Susans and your Franks. And I allowed them to ask or assign themselves a gamer tag. And I did that using just standard classwork. What is your gamer tag? So it's a question I posed, and it looks like 5 students have turned it in out of 26. And let's see here, SL Penny here. I got CP Speech. So a couple I created: Crondo the Mathematician, Frida the Libromancer, Cyan. That's a pretty good one. So I created a bunch here. Sorry for that interruption. Gamer tag. So I'm allowing kids to pick their gamer tag, and then from there, I allowed them to create groups. So we have the Mr. Belvederes, the Adventure Knots, Team No Homework. Those are 3 guilds that occur within my classroom. Now, your standard, what you see in a standard model of the classroom is, you're assigned tests, quizzes, homework, and classwork. And again, this is kind of falling back to a lot of the information that Chris Avilas has described in his gamification guide and his courses and talks and things like that. So by all means, definitely follow up at techedupteacher.com because, again, he is the source of this information and will do a far better job of explaining it than I am, but I'm taking a crack at it here. So rather than giving them things like tests, quizzes, homework, and classwork, I am redefining them as epic quests, mysteries, missions, and adventures. Then rather than giving considering percentages, so tests are worth 40%, I'm assuming that equals a total 100% grade. I'm assuming a total XP score of 10,000. With tests being 44,000 of them, mysteries being 3,000. So again, this is really just the same thing, only I'm changing from a percentage-based thing to an experience-based thing. But in the eyes of the kid, what they're seeing is when they are doing a homework assignment and they see a 70, now they're not seeing that they got 70 out of 100. They're not seeing that they got a C minus. What they're seeing is that they earned 70 points out of 100 experience points. So now it's not this fluctuation between I'm doing bad to I'm doing good. This is I am gaining something. Every time I am taking a lesson, every time I'm taking a quiz, every time I'm taking an assignment, I am gaining experience points. I may not have gained as much as I would have the first before this assignment, but now I am. And what you'll see is that kids are going to try for gaining as much experience points as they can. They may not always succeed, but again, if you build in opportunities for extra credit, because then you will. Because again, the goal isn't necessarily to just get kids to get grades that you want. The goal is to educate them. So if that extra credit is extra attempts to educate a student, then why not give it to them? I'm all about extra credit. But as you can see here, once you start adding in these numbers, it's very easy to convert back to the grade that you need for that report card. So the 9,590 XP points can easily become a 96. The 9,290 can easily become the 93. So you don't have to throw out your curriculum, but you can still preface all of this in a way that is much more palatable to students. And from here, you can see there is no longer any kind of negative impacts that you see from getting 8,240 points. You're still working towards this overall goal that the team is working towards. But now you also have the ability to build in competitiveness within the classroom. So now I can see, okay, well, the Belvederes seem to be doing the best in the classroom, so the Adventure Knots need to pick it up a little bit. So they might encourage each other to work towards it. You could also use the same mechanism to, pit one class against the other. So now this class A or class B could be, the Horde, and class B could be the Alliance, and you can see, these scores play back and forth against each other and see, what works for, what works as this competitiveness builds. They work together to try to achieve things. The other side of things you could look at is the idea of these badges. So badges, whatever you want to use to create the badges, of course. Badges are things that you could work through for extra credit within a class, within any given assignment, to earn, and these have tangible impacts on kids. So if I was a kid and I earned the Traveler badge, what does that get me? Well, one thing is it gets me an increased amount of experience points. Now, you'll notice the experience points would equal the same amount of a single classwork assignment. But rather than saying you get to not do a classwork assignment, which is encouraging kids away from the educational process, you are giving them the value of that assignment. So you're saying, here you go, here's this 200 experience points that you've earned. It's not the same as saying I'm giving you a free A. It's I'm giving you experience points for having earned this badge because you have earned this badge. You have done this extra work towards earning it. But also you get this little bit of extra access that is built into each badge. So for instance, this one says get an extra day to turn in an assignment, or decide who gets what classroom job for the week, or you get an extra life, so you get an extra shot at adding experience to a previous quest. So these are all different kinds of ways that you can build your own badge system or achievements within your classroom. So there you go. You got a little bit more gamification within your classroom. Now let's take a look at some of the assignments as they use SAMR, and also as we go through the different levels of gamification that you can include. Everything has like a slight gamified aspect to it. So let's look at our monomyth campaign. here we have SAMR, S-A-M-R, and I created them in order so that they're easy to see. So let's look at an example of substitution. Here we see that substitution, I give, again, I'm giving multiple paths to the same solution. So path 1 is bookbound and path 2 is movie march. And I am asking kids, and I basically through Google Classroom send out this monomyth cycle. And I ask them to either read a book or watch a movie or discuss a previous book that they've read or a previous movie that they've watched, and plot into them the different stages in that book that adhere to the different stages of the monomyth. So at what point in Star Wars was Luke called to adventure? At what point did he refuse the call? At what point was he provided supernatural aid, either through the lightsaber or through the meeting that he had with Obi-Wan? At what point is he going through the road of trials? At what point is he meeting the goddess? At what point is does he receive his ultimate boon? As I am describing these things, I am going through and filling these out. Now, this is while this might be unique, this is still technically substitution. This is something that I could basically be doing on paper, but I'm using Google Classroom because it is a easy method for me to distribute and receive work from my students. It's colorful. It's easier to type and easier to transfer information back and forth. Easier to present. So there are technically augmentations through the use of substitution, but on the whole, I'm not actually augmenting the actual learning through the use of technology. But what else am I doing as that relates to gamification? I am including achievements. So my requirement was that you plotted out at least 5 of these events within to reach the goal of the quest. If you are, or the goal of the adventure. If you go and you plot out more than the 5-box requirement, you earn 1 point towards the above and beyond badge. If you try to go through both paths, then you earn the traveler, and then you get a badge, 1 point towards the traveler. So if I'm creating multiple adventures and I'm creating multiple paths for each adventure, they have the opportunity of earning badges that way. So there you go. That's a simple substitution. So let's look at augmentation. So here, rather than distributing a assignment to each kid, what I'm doing is I'm sharing a single document with every student in the classroom. So now what the students would be tasked to do is, for instance, here I've broken the tabs up into the different guilds, right? And what I'm asking kids to do is to create an outline for their own monomyth. So each student would log into here and they would create, ordinary world where the character initially exists, what their call to adventure is, and they would create the outline for a story based off of the understanding that they're in order to try to keep things as neutral as possible, to refer to the hero as a protagonist, the enemy as the antagonist. But here's the thing: as they do this process, they so this is augmentation because they are collaborating together on this single project, and then to gamify this, what I'm doing is at each stage, I'm rolling a d6 dice. That's a 6-sided die, your standard die that you use. So if I land with a 1 to 2, it falls to Crondo the Mathematician. If I land a 3 through 4, it's going to Frida the Libromancer. And if I'm rolling a 5 to 6, it's going to Physical Eddie. Now what happens is, as I roll a dice at each stage, a student needs to, read their section of the stage. So if I roll a 1, then I'm reading Crondo's Ordinary World. If I roll a 3, during the next set of the stage, then I'm reading Frida's Call to Adventure. The trick here is, since the monomyth is supposed to describe basically every hero's adventure, I wanted to see how likely it is for the student's narrative to make sense regardless of which story it's coming from. And this is to kind of like help reinforce this idea that this monomyth actually is a theorem that describes the general processes that all heroes go through. So if the story makes sense regardless of whether it's told by Krondo, by Frida, or by Eddie at any given point, then it makes sense. So you can listen to how the story goes as it goes on, and they get to present it in front of the classroom. And they then at the very end you can determine which guild did the best at making a cohesive storyline. Into that, I'm building a unique badge, so the Thespian badge. So each member of the winning group earns the Thespian badge, and you get the Above and Beyond badge if you act out the scenes you're reading. So again, gives kids the opportunity to engage in role play, engage in putting some emphasis behind the characters that they're creating, putting their heart into it. And that, is just augmentation. We haven't even gotten into modification and redefinition, but already you're talking about collaboration between students. You're talking about, creating story structure. You're gamifying the classroom, and you're utilizing all these collaboration tools. So let's look at modification. Now, I broke up modification up into 2 assignments, but it still kind of works. So with modification, went too far, went too deep. There we go. With modification, one member of each guild, so here I'll describe this without reading it in full. Each guild functions as its own role-playing session. I provide a hook, and I believe I provided the hook. There we go. So I said I provided 3 hooks, but I only wrote down 1. I provide a hook to each group, and the hook defines a segment of the monomyth. So the GM, whoever is designated as the GM within each group, will basically take on the role of describing the scenario that occurs within this hook. The other 2, in this case 2 students, take on the role of characters. Now, as the GM, the goal is to get the other kids in their group to go through the process and go through the steps of getting through the descriptions. The end goal, is to determine if they are able to reach a point or conclusion that would invariably lead them to the next stage of the monomyth. So that means not only through role-playing, understanding what stage of the monomyth they're in, but also going through the character development that they would need to get to the next stage. And through this interplay, you're engaging kids to play, to role play, and to invest in themselves into the narrative, which allows them to more easily understand the concepts that are floating around within that subset of the monomyth. And you're reinforcing what's happening in each stage. So if in this stage I am leaving my comfortable life as a noble, and I am being forced out and potentially never to return again, I am fully investing now my understanding of what stage of the monomyth I am in. And I'm moving out of the ordinary world into the call of adventure. As they're going through this process, they're recording themselves using the Chromebook or whatever apparatus that they're using within their classroom. By recording themselves and submitting that video, I, as the educator, have the ability to watch the video, see what problems occurred through the role playing, provide guidance and instruction and feedback at a later date, but also see that they are playing through the roles as they were intended to. I can see the interaction between the students as they work out what they're dealing with. So from a SAMR perspective, I am gaining a lot more in-depth understanding of how kids are doing, because I, as an individual teacher, can't be sitting in every single group all at the same time. The other thing I'm doing is I'm encouraging kids into this aspect of investing into their characters, investing into the stories that they're reading, and invest in the stories that they're creating. So that, from a gamification aspect, is phenomenal. And then I'm building, of course, my achievements into that, and then I could follow that up with an online assessment, or a mystery, as I called it. So here, now I get to follow up each session with questionnaires, like what stage of the monomyth cycle was represented by hook 1, what evidence exists within the hook to suggest it. They can give their answers there. What is the most likely next stage of the monomyth cycle? Do you believe that your group has successfully gotten to the point where you can move into that stage next? And then finally, I ask them to describe what happens next. So now I see what the differences are. And if I play back those sessions for the other groups, they get to see how the same character that they took was played differently, so that they can understand that their own understanding of who a character is or how a story plays out may not necessarily be how the character is interpreted by every reader. So yeah, that's modification right there. You're changing the assignment from what it was to something completely different from what it was. But again, still within the aspect of it is being augmented, but still being modified from what it was through the use of technology. Now here's an example of redefinition. So I have taken all of the information on knowledge of what monomyth is based off of prior set examples. I am understanding a simplified version of the monomyth through creating these story outlines and seeing how the monomyth is in fact a monomyth, a single connecting theorem that connects all these heroic storylines. And then in my next stage, I'm actually working through the characteristics of each story. So I'm building onto this structure of education, all the while playing games and hopefully having fun. So now I move into redefinition, and I'm moving into the final stage of my educational process of creating my own monomyth. So now in a typical substitution environment, I'm just writing a story. In an augmentation, I am writing a story and adding pictures. But here, what I'm doing is I'm allowing kids to use Google Slides to create their own choose your own adventure. And I fall back to that choose your own adventure because it's the kind of books that I loved as a kid, but still a functional option. So here I've got an example of the basic layout for a choose your own adventure story, and I could provide guidance to students on how to create this, and then once I do, they could take it on from there and creating their own story. And I'll give you a little bit of an example of how I create it. So here's my title page, and now I move to the call to adventure. These are the words of my opening story. Oh, I should probably jump into presentation mode here so that it goes automatically. So, as you can tell, I am giving the option of crossing that threshold here. I'm describing what's happening here, and I've created buttons. You can either refuse the call to adventure, or you can answer the call to adventure. So,
take the red pill.
Let's see what happens when I refuse the call to adventure. Story ends, I wake up in my bed and believe it was all a dream. And I've got Pee-wee here to help me out. So what am I doing here? I'm creating a story. I'm using my own words, but I'm also using other forms of media to express the events in a unique way. And I'm creating a game. I'm creating my own game. I'm creating my own narrative and my own choose your own adventure that other kids get to play. And that's a big part of gamification. That's a big part of redefinition.
Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
And there you go. That's what I'm offering too. So I hope that was informative. I hope that gave you an idea of what gamification could mean in your classroom. I hope that gives you information about SAMR. And I hope this was a valuable, somewhat, how long have I been running this for? Hour and 10 minutes of your time. Thank you. And you can reach me at bbars. That's B as in Bravo, E as in Echo, B as in Bravo, AR, C as in Charlie, E as in Echo, on Twitter. You can look me up there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Bye.